The Arizona desert knew Colt Brennan by the rhythm of his spurs, a slow, deliberate sound that announced his presence long before his shadow fell across any threshold. At 41, he carried his reputation like a second gun, heavy with the weight of 19 lives taken in fair fights that had never felt fair to the families left behind. Men who knew his name spoke it in whispers, and men who didn't know it learned quickly to recognize the look of someone who'd walked too long in death's shadow. His horse, a steel-gray gelding named Phantom, picked his way carefully across the broken terrain that stretched between Tucson and nowhere in particular. Colt had been riding for 3 days without destination, following trails that led deeper into kind of country where a man could disappear entirely if he had reasons for wanting the world to forget he'd ever existed. It was exactly the kind of emptiness that suited someone who'd grown tired of the weight of his own legend. The desert afternoon pressed against him like a living thing, all heat and silence broken only by the whisper wind through saguaro and the distant cry of a hawk circling thermals that rose from sun-baked stone. Colt had learned to find peace in such emptiness, to appreciate landscapes that asked nothing of him except the basic competence required to stay alive in country that killed careless men with casual efficiency. He was perhaps 20 miles from the nearest water when he saw the dust cloud, a small disturbance against the larger canvas of desert stillness that caught his attention the way unusual movement always did for men whose survival depended on noticing details that others might miss. As he drew closer, the source of the disturbance resolved into something that made him rein in Phantom and reach instinctively for his field glasses. A horse, riderless and clearly panicked, galloped across the broken ground with the kind of desperate energy that spoke an animal fleeing from predators or pain. Apache pony, by the look of it, a tough little paint mare built for endurance rather than speed, the kind of mount that could carry a rider across impossible terrain but would never win prizes for beauty. Colt followed the horse's back trail with his eyes, reading the story written in disturbed sand and scattered stones. The mare had been running hard for at least a mile, probably longer, and whatever had unseated her rider had happened suddenly enough to leave no time for controlled dismounting. He found the boy 50 yards from where the trail began, crumpled against a boulder that provided the only shade for miles in any direction. Apache, maybe 12 or 13 years old, wearing clothes that mixed traditional and practical elements. Buckskin leggings decorated with intricate beadwork, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and moccasins that spoke of someone who'd been taught to move quietly through country where noise could mean death. Blood had dried on the boy's forehead where he'd struck something during his fall, and his left arm was bent at an angle that suggested a break rather than a simple sprain. But he was breathing, and when Colt approached, dark eyes opened to track his movement with the wary intelligence of someone who'd been taught that white men usually meant trouble for Apache children. "Easy there, son," Colt said quietly, dismounting and moving slowly enough to avoid triggering the fight-or-flight response that kept wild things alive in dangerous country. "I'm not here to hurt you." The boy said nothing, just continued to watch Colt with the kind of attention that came from children who'd learned to read adult intentions as a matter of survival. His breathing was shallow but steady, and Colt could see the effort it took for him to remain conscious despite what was obviously considerable pain. "Looks like that horse of yours dumped you pretty hard," Colt continued, kneeling just outside the boy's reach and keeping his hands visible. "What's your name, son?" Still no response, though Colt caught the slight relaxation in the boy's posture that suggested he was being understood even if he chose not to reply. Fear, probably, mixed with the kind of pride that Apache children learned early, the knowledge that showing weakness to strangers could be more dangerous than enduring pain in silence. Colt pulled his water bottle from his saddlebags, uncorking it and taking a small sip before offering it to the boy. "Water's clean," he said simply, "and you need it more than I do." This time, the boy's eyes fixed on the bottle with the intensity of someone who'd been in the desert long enough to understand that dehydration killed more travelers than bullets or snake bites. Slowly, carefully, he reached out with his good arm to accept the offering. As the boy drank, Colt found himself studying the young face with an attention that surprised him. There was something in the child's features, the stubbornness of his jaw, the way he controlled his breathing to manage pain, that reminded Colt of someone he'd once known, someone who'd been taken from him before he'd learned to appreciate what he'd lost. "That arm's broken, Colt observed as the boy handed back the water bottle. "And you got a head injury that needs attention. Lucky thing I happened along when I did." The boy's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced that luck had anything to do with their encounter, but he made no protest when Colt began examining his injuries with the careful competence of someone who'd patched up enough wounds to understand the difference between serious and fatal. "This is going to hurt," Colt warned as he began fashioning a splint from materials in his saddlebags. "But it'll hurt less than letting that bone heal crooked." The boy endured the treatment without complaint, though Colt could see the white-knuckled grip he maintained on his good hand as broken bones were set and secured. When it was finished, Colt offered jerky and hardtack from his supplies, watching as the child ate with the careful efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste food in uncertain times. "Got a name?" Colt asked again, settling back against his saddle to share the meager meal. This time, the boy met his eyes directly. "Little Wolf," he said in careful English, his voice hoarse but clear. "Son of Chief Standing Bear." Colt felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized the name. Standing Bear was one of the more prominent Apache leaders, a man who'd managed to maintain an uneasy peace with territorial authorities while protecting his people from the worst excesses of government policy. If this was his son, lying injured in the middle of nowhere, then there were probably search parties combing the desert for any sign of him. "What happened to you, Little Wolf?" Colt asked gently. "How'd you end up out here alone?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much truth was safe to share with a stranger whose intentions remained unclear. "Hunting," he said finally. "Went farther than I should have. Horse stepped in a prairie dog hole." It was probably true as far as it went, but Colt suspected there was more to the story, some combination of adolescent pride and the kind of risk-taking that convinced young men they were invincible right up until the moment they discovered they weren't. "Well," Colt said, rising and beginning to pack up the makeshift camp, "can't leave you out here for the buzzards. Looks like you and I are going to be traveling companions for a while." As he helped the little wolf onto Phantom's back, settling him as comfortably as possible given the circumstances, Colt found himself thinking about destiny and the strange paths it chose for men who thought they'd left such considerations behind. 3 days ago, he'd been a drifter with no purpose beyond staying ahead of his own reputation. Now he was responsible for getting an Apache chief's son safely home, a task that would require him to navigate both the physical dangers of the desert and the political complexities of a territory where Apache-white relations balanced on a knife's edge. But looking at the boy's determined attempt to stay conscious despite his injuries, Colt felt something stirring in his chest that he thought was dead and buried with his own family. The fierce protectiveness that came from caring about someone else's survival more than your own convenience. Tomorrow would bring challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, as they made camp beside a trickle of water that emerged from hidden springs, Colt Brennan allowed himself to believe that maybe some purposes were worth the risks they demanded. The second day brought fever. Little Wolf tried to hide it with a stoic determination that Apache children learned early, but Colt had seen enough wounded men to recognize the telltale signs. The glassy brightness in dark eyes, the way small hands trembled despite the desert heat, the careful breathing of someone fighting to stay conscious when their body demanded rest. "We need to stop," Colt said, though they'd been riding for less than 2 hours, and he'd hoped to cover more ground before the sun reached its merciless peak. "I can continue," Little Wolf protested, but his voice lacked conviction, and the way he swayed in the saddle suggested otherwise. "I'm sure you can," Colt replied gently, guiding Phantom toward an outcropping of rocks that would provide shade and concealment. "But I need to check that head wound, and Phantom could use some rest." It was a graceful fiction that allowed the boy to accept help without admitting weakness, and Colt could see Little Wolf recognizing it for what it was, an adult's way of providing care without demanding surrender or pride. The wound had indeed worsened overnight, showing signs of infection that would need immediate attention if they were going to avoid serious complications. Colt cleaned it as best he could with their limited water supply, then applied a poultice made from desert plants his own Apache friend had taught him to recognize years ago, back when he'd been young enough to believe that friendship could transcend the racial boundaries that divided the territory. "You know medicine," Little Wolf observed, watching Colt work with the careful attention of someone who understood that knowledge was survival. "Some," Colt admitted. "Had a friend once who taught me a few things about staying alive in country like this." "Apache friend?" Colt nodded, his hands never pausing in their work. Man named Gray Hawk. Saved my life more than once. Back when I was too green to know the desert, could kill a man faster than any gunfight. What happened to him? The question hung in the air between them, carrying weight that neither had expected. Colt found himself remembering Gray Hawk's face, the easy laughter that had made their friendship possible despite everything the world had taught them about their peoples being natural enemies. Cavalry patrol killed him, Colt said finally, his voice flat with old pain. Said he was off the reservation without permission, though he had papers saying otherwise. Sometimes papers don't matter when soldiers want an excuse for target practice. Little Wolf absorbed this information with the gravity that Apache children brought to discussions of death and injustice. Is that why you became a gunfighter? To fight soldiers? No, Colt replied honestly. I became a gunfighter because I was good at it, and because angry young men do stupid things when they hurt too much to think straight. But I never killed anyone who didn't draw on me first. My father says that white men often become what they hate when they try to fight what they cannot change. The wisdom in those words hit Colt like a physical blow, forcing him to confront truths about himself that he'd spent years avoiding. Your father's a smart man. What else does he say about white men? That some remember how to be human, even after the world tries to teach them otherwise. Little Wolf met Colt's eyes directly. That the measure of a man is not the color of his skin, but what he does when no one is watching except his own conscience. They spent the heat of the day in the shade, sharing water and jerky, while Little Wolf's fever broke, and his color gradually returned to something approaching normal. Colt found himself talking more than he had in months, telling stories about his travels, about the places he'd seen, and the people he'd met in his wandering across the Southwest. You have no family? Little Wolf asked during one of their conversations. Had a wife once. Little girl, too. Colt's voice carried the careful neutrality that came from discussing wounds that had never properly healed. Fever took them both one winter. Same fever that's trying to take you. Come to think of it. I'm sorry, Little Wolf said with a formal courtesy that Apache children learn for acknowledging others' losses. Long time ago, Colt replied, though they both understood that some kind of time had nothing to do with years or seasons. As evening approached and they prepared to resume their journey, Little Wolf asked a question that had been hanging between them since they had met. Why are you helping me? You could have left me to die. Would have been easier. Colt considered the question seriously, understanding that his answer would determine the nature of whatever relationship they built during their remaining time together. Maybe because I see something in you that reminds me of what I used to believe about the world. Maybe because your father's right about some white men remembering how to be human. Or maybe, Little Wolf suggested with the hint of a smile, because Gray Hawk taught you that some friendships are worth the risks they bring. As they rode to the cooling desert evening, following stars that Gray Hawk had taught Colt to read like a map written across the sky, Colt found himself thinking about legacy and the strange ways that dead friends continue to influence the choices of those they'd left behind. He'd thought he was helping an injured boy reach safety, but somewhere along the trail, it had become something more, a chance to honor a friendship that had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. On the third day, they reached the edge of Apache territory, marked not by fences or signs, but by the subtle changes that Colt had learned to recognize. The way the land seemed to watch them, the feeling of eyes that saw without being seen, the sense that they were no longer traveling through empty country, but through someone's carefully guarded home. Little Wolf sat straighter in the saddle, his injuries forgotten in the relief of approaching familiar ground. We are close now, he said, pointing toward a cluster of mesas that rose from the desert floor like ancient monuments to endurance. How close? Colt asked, scanning the horizon for signs of the watchers he was certain were observing their approach. My father's camp is in the canyon beyond those red rocks. Perhaps 2 hours if we do not stop. Little Wolf paused, studying Colt's face with new intensity. You could leave me here. I can find my own way from this place. It was an offer born from understanding that white men who entered Apache territory uninvited often didn't leave again. That Colt had already risked more than most would have by bringing a chief's son this far into country, where his presence might be interpreted as threat rather than kindness. Colt agreed. But I started something when I picked you up off that desert floor, and I figure I ought to see it through the end. You might not like how it ends, Little Wolf warned. My father will want to know why a white gunfighter was traveling alone through our hunting grounds. Some of my people will say you took me prisoner, that you are returning me only because you fear our revenge. And what will you tell them? Little Wolf considered this question with the seriousness of someone who understood that his words could determine whether Colt lived or died in the next few hours. I will tell them the truth, that you found me dying and chose to save my life when you could have taken my scalp instead, that you shared your food and water and medicine without asking for payment or promises. Think they'll believe you? I think my father will listen to his son's words before making judgment, Little Wolf replied. And I think that a man who saves Apache children without expectation of reward might be different from the white men my people have learned to fear. They were met at the canyon entrance by scouts who materialized from the landscape like spirits taking physical form. 3 Apache warriors whose horses moved with liquid silence across terrain that would have challenged mountain goats. They surrounded Colt and Little Wolf with the fluid precision of predators who had hunted together for years, weapons ready but not yet threatening. The lead scout spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Little Wolf responded in the same language, his words tumbling over each other with the urgency of someone who had much to explain and little time to do it. Colt couldn't understand the conversation, but he could read body language and tone well enough to follow its general direction. Surprise at Little Wolf's condition, suspicion about Colt's presence, questions about how they'd come to be traveling together. Gradually, the tension in the scouts' postures eased, replaced by something that might have been cautious acceptance. They will escort us to my father, Little Wolf translated. But they ask that you keep your weapons visible but not in your hands. A gesture of respect, not surrender. Colt nodded, understanding the careful diplomacy involved in such arrangements. He kept his hands well away from his guns while making no move to remove them, a compromise that acknowledged the reality of their situation while maintaining the dignity that Apache culture valued in all its dealings. The ride to Chief Standing Bear's camp took them through country that seemed designed by nature to test the courage of invaders, narrow canyons where ambush was not just possible but probable, switchbacking trails that left horses and riders exposed against the sky, hidden watchers whose presence could be felt even when they couldn't be seen. When they finally reached the village, Cole found himself looking at a community that existed in careful balance between tradition and adaptation. Traditional Apache wickiups stood alongside more permanent structures built for year-round habitation, and the people who emerged to watch their arrival wore a mixture of native and practical clothing that spoke of a culture learning to navigate between 2 worlds. Chief Standing Bear himself was a man whose presence commanded immediate respect, tall, whether by years of leadership during impossible times, carrying himself with the dignity of someone who'd learned to make decisions that would affect generations. He studied Colt with eyes that missed nothing, taking the guns, the way he sat his horse, the careful deference he showed to Apache customs without surrendering his own identity. "My son tells me you saved his life," Standing Bear said in English that carried only the faintest accent, "that you asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to see him safely home." "Your son needed help," Colt replied simply. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Perhaps," Standing Bear agreed. "But in my experience, few white men remember what decency means when dealing with Apache children. Fewer still would risk entering our territory to ensure a child's safe return." The chief gestured toward his wickiup, an invitation that Colt understood carried significance beyond simple hospitality. "You will share our fire tonight. Tomorrow, we will speak of debts that cannot be repaid with gold or promises." As evening settled over the Apache camp and Colt found himself sitting beside Little Wolf around Chief Standing Bear's fire, sharing food and stories with people with every reason to consider him an enemy, he began to understand that his simple act of kindness had set in motion forces that would change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The ceremony began at dawn, when the desert air still carried the coolness of night, and the eastern sky painted itself in shades of rose and gold that reminded Colt of his mother's favorite quilt. He woke to the sound of drums, not the war drums that territorial newspapers described in breathless account of Apache savagery, but something deeper and more complex, rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. Little Wolf appeared at his elbow as Colt emerged from the guest's wickiup, where he'd spent the night, the boy moving with renewed energy that spoke of youth's remarkable capacity for healing. "My father is called the council," Little Wolf explained. "All the warriors, all the elders, all the women who speak for children. They will hear what happened between us, and they will decide what honor requires." "Decide what?" Colt asked, though something in the boy's tone suggested he might not like the answer. "Whether you are to be thanked or punished for bringing me home," Little Wolf said with the brutal honesty that children sometimes employed when adults were being deliberately obtuse. "Some believe you took me captive and are returning me only to avoid our revenge. Others think you are a spy, sent to learn our weaknesses. A few believe you are exactly what you appear to be, a man who helps someone in need." Colt absorbed this information, understanding that he was about to be judged by standards he didn't fully comprehend, by people who had every historical reason to distrust his motives. "And what do you believe?" "I believe you're the closest thing to a father I have known since my own father became too busy leading our people to remember that his son still needs guidance," Little Wolf replied quietly. "I believe you treated my wounds with the same care you have shown your own child. I believe you are a good man pretending to be something harder because the world has hurt you too much to trust in goodness." The words hit Colt like a physical blow, stripping away pretenses he'd maintained for so long they'd almost forgotten they were pretenses. Before he could respond, Chief Standing Bear approached, his face painted with symbols that marked this as formal ceremony rather than casual conversation. "It is time," the chief said simply. The council circle had been prepared in the center of the village, with stones arranged to mark the sacred directions and sage burning to purify the space where important words would be spoken. Colt found himself seated beside Little Wolf, facing dozens of Apache faces that regarded him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility to something that might have been hope. Chief Standing Bear spoke first, his words carrying the formal cadence of someone conducting business that would be remembered and retold for generations. He recounted the circumstances of Little Wolf's disappearance, the search parties that had combed the desert for 3 days without finding trace of boy or horse, the grief that had settled over the village like winter fog. Then Little Wolf was called upon to tell his story, and Colt listened with growing amazement as the boy transformed their simple encounter into something approaching legend. In Little Wolf's telling, Colt became not just a helpful stranger, but a figure of almost mythical compassion, a white man who'd chosen mercy over profit, protection over convenience, honor over safety. When it came time for Colt to speak, he found himself struggling to find words that could bridge the gap between cultures that seemed to operate by entirely different definitions of truth and meaning. "I found a boy who was hurt," Colt said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the desert stillness. "I helped him because it was the right thing to do. I brought him home because that's where he belonged. I don't need thanks, and I don't want payment. Some things a man does because they're worth doing, not because they'll profit him." The council deliberated in Apache, voices rising and falling in heated discussion that occasionally grew animated enough to suggest fundamental disagreements about whatever judgment they were preparing to render. Colt caught Little Wolf's name mentioned frequently, along with words he didn't recognize but that seemed to carry significant weight in their cultural calculations. Finally, Chief Standing Bear rose and addressed Colt directly. "The council has reached its decision," he announced. "You have shown honor to our people when you had no obligation to do so. You have treated our son as you would treat your own blood. For this, you have earned something that cannot be bought or taken by force, the respect of the Apache nation." Before Colt could respond, Standing Bear made a gesture that brought dozens of warriors to their feet. They moved with ceremonial precision toward where Colt sat, and for a heart-stopping moment, he wondered if respect was going to be expressed through methods that might prove fatal to the recipient. Instead, something extraordinary happened. One by one, the warriors approached and knelt before him, each man offering the kind of formal acknowledgement that Colt had seen Apache give only to their most revered leaders. It was an honor so unprecedented that several of the younger warriors clearly struggled to complete the gesture, their faces showing the internal conflict between traditional respect for enemies and genuine gratitude for unprecedented kindness. "Rise," Colt Brennan, Chief Standing Bear, commanded when the last warrior had paid his respects. "From this day forward, you are known to our people as he who guards children. Your safety is our responsibility, Your enemies are our enemies. Your honor is our honor. As Colt stood on shaking legs, overwhelmed by recognition he'd never expected and wasn't sure he deserved, Little Wolf stepped forward and pressed something into his hands, a small medicine bundle decorated with intricate beadwork that had probably taken weeks to complete. For my grandmother, Little Wolf explained. She says it will protect you on the long trail and remind you that you now have family among the Apache people. Looking around the circle of faces that no longer showed suspicion, but something approaching affection, Colt Brennan understood that his days as a solitary drifter were over. He'd found something in this desert village that he'd been searching for without knowing it, not just respect or gratitude, but belonging, purpose, a place in a world that was defined by what he'd given rather than what he'd taken. 3 months later, Colt Brennan rode into the territorial capital of Phoenix with Little Wolf beside him, both of them carrying themselves with the confidence of men who understood their place in the world and weren't ashamed of what that place required of them. The stares they drew were a mixture of curiosity and hostility. A notorious gunfighter traveling openly with an Apache boy was a kind of sight that made newspaper editors reach for their pens and territorial officials reach for their guns. The journey that had brought them here began with Little Wolf's request to see the wider world beyond Apache territory, to understand the complexities of society that surrounded his people like a closing trap. Chief Standing Bear had agreed, but only on condition that Colt serve as guide and protector, a role that had transformed the former Gunslinger into something unprecedented in territorial history. A white man who spoke for Apache interests in places where Apache voices were never heard. "You sure about this?" Colt asked as they dismounted in front of the territorial government building, an imposing structure of adobe and ambition that seemed designed to intimidate visitors into submission. "I am sure that my people need to understand their enemies if they are to survive," Little Wolf replied with wisdom that seemed far beyond his 13 years. "And I am sure that you will not let harm come to me, just as you did not let me die in the desert." The meeting they'd come for had been arranged through channels that existed in the gray areas between official diplomacy and personal favor. Territorial Agent Morrison, the same man who tried to have Starhawks murdered in the previous story, had agreed to discuss Apache concerns about missing supply shipments and unauthorized incursions into treaty-guaranteed hunting grounds. What Morrison hadn't expected was to find himself facing Colt Brennan across a conference table, with Little Wolf translating between languages and cultures that seemed to exist in different centuries despite occupying the same geographical space. "This is highly irregular," Morrison protested as they settled into chairs that had been designed more for intimidation than comfort. "Territorial policy regarding Apache affairs is conducted through official channels, not through whatever this is supposed to be." "This," Colt said quietly, his voice carrying the control menace that had once made him the most feared gunfighter in the Southwest, "is a conversation between men who want to avoid the kind of trouble that makes newspapers and gets politicians voted out of office." Morrison's face went pale as he recognized the implicit threat. He'd heard stories about Colt Brennan's transformation from hired killer to Apache advocate, but seeing the man in person made those stories suddenly terrifyingly real. "What do you want?" Morrison asked, his voice lacking the authority he probably intended to project. Little Wolf spoke for the first time, his careful English carrying across the room with startling clarity. "We want to know why food promised to our people never arrives. We want to know why white hunters kill elk in our treaty lands while our children go hungry. We want to know why territorial officials grow rich while Apache families starve." The questions hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, each one carrying implications that could destroy careers and reputations if pursued by people with the courage and connections to demand answers. Morrison clearly understood this, his eyes moving between Colt and Little Wolf as he calculated the political mathematics of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his control. "These are complex issues," Morrison said finally, "matters of federal policy that can't be resolved in a single meeting." "Then let's make it simple," Colt suggested, leaning forward slightly in a gesture that made Morrison instinctively reach for the gun he wasn't wearing. "You're going to ensure that food shipments reach Apache families on schedule and in full quantity. You're going to enforce hunting restrictions that protect treaty rights. And you're going to do it because the alternative is having this conversation become public knowledge." "You're threatening a federal official," Morrison blustered, but his voice carried more fear than outrage. I'm offering a corrupt bureaucrat the opportunity to start doing his job, Colt corrected. Before someone with less patience and better connections decides that territorial politics need permanent adjustment, the meeting continued for another hour, with Little Wolf asking pointed questions about supply contracts and Morrison providing increasingly uncomfortable answers about administrative complexities that seemed designed to obscure rather than explain. By the time they left, agreements had been reached that would ensure Apache families receive the food and protection guaranteed by treaties that most territorial officials treated as suggestions rather than binding law. Do you think he will keep his promises? Little Wolf asked as they walked back toward their horses. I think he'll keep them as long as he believes the alternative is worse, Colt replied. And I think we'll be back here often enough to remind him what that alternative looks like. As they rode out of Phoenix toward the desert country that had become more home to Colt than any place he'd ever lived, Little Wolf asked a question that had been building between them since their journey began. What happens when I am grown? When I no longer need protection? Colt considered this question seriously, understanding that it carried implications about the future that neither of them could fully predict. I guess we'll find out when we get there, he said finally, but I suspect that by then you'll be the one doing the protecting. And you will let me? Son, Colt said, using the word that had become natural between them, I suspect that by the time you're grown, this territory is going to need all the protection it can get from men who remember what honor means. As they rode toward the setting sun that painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Colt Brennan reflected on the strange paths that had led him from feared gunfighter to unlikely father figure, from man who took lives to man who protected them. The transformation hadn't been easy or complete. He still carried his guns, still moved with the wariness of someone who'd made too many enemies to ever completely relax. But riding beside Little Wolf through country that no longer felt empty or hostile, Colt understood that redemption didn't require becoming someone entirely different. Sometimes it just required becoming the best version of who you'd always had the potential to be, given the right reasons and the right companion for the journey. Behind them, 80 Apache warriors maintained their traditional distance, invisible to casual observation, but always present, always watching, always ready to honor the bonds that had been forged in desert silence, and sealed with gestures of respect that transcended the boundaries between peoples who shared the same land but often seemed to inhabit different worlds. It was protection Colt had never asked for and didn't entirely understand, but as he listened to Little Wolf's easy laughter carried on the evening wind, he began to believe that some gifts were worth accepting, even when accepting them changed everything you thought you knew about your place in the world and your obligations to the future.